Hey Juan Carlos.
Hola Luis, how are you? ¿Cómo estás?
Muy bien. I'm so glad to finally get you on the screen and on the podcast. I've been trying to interview various people and I've been running into the same issue. It's like, it's so indicative of what's going on in the world. But we're here, and how are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I mean, I'm in a good place right now.
Oh, I love to hear that.
It's in the sense of it's been an overwhelming past few weeks, right? With everything with George Floyd and the protests and the marches and just trying to wrap your head around that as it's happening. So it's been a couple of weeks, and that work is still going strong, right? But yeah, I mean, in a good place right now.
Nice. And the good place is Southern California, right?
Yeah, that's a recent move. I lived in Chicago for 21 years.
Wow.
I just recently moved back this past last summer, at the end of last summer. hmm
How has that transition been?
Hard.
Yeah?
Yeah, because uh, uh, the reason I moved from Chicago over here, because in Chicago everything was going great, everything was going fantastic, and but I had been there for 21 years, right? I was born in Mexico, in Chihuahua, and emigrated over here with my family, with my mom, single parent, and my brothers and sisters. And so I grew up in the LA area in Pasadena, and that's where we are. And then in my mid 20s, I moved to Chicago to pursue a degree at the Art Institute of Chicago and at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And and I've been there for 21 years, which means, you know, I missed all those Mother's Days. I missed all those birthdays. I my When I left, my youngest sister was 11 years old, right? And we were very close. And then I come back and she's in her 30s, It's that kind of thing, right? And she has a little girl of her own now.
Oh.
Um, and so, it's a lot of those growing things that I missed, right, with them. And so, it just got to a point where I've had such a beautiful relationship with Chicago and the neighborhoods and the families there that I was like, I mean, I could easily just settle there. And I was like, I can easily settle here. This is going fantastic. Um, but then I realized also that, throughout all that time is that, well, this is a good opportunity where I'm still young enough and old enough to go back and continue growing with my family, before, let's say, another 10, 20 years, I'm, I have to come back for another reason, whether it's due to health issues uh, or to catch up on something that I've already missed. Do you see what I'm saying? So
Absolutely.
that was my main reason for moving back, and a lot of friends were like, well, are you going back because you got a new position somewhere, or you got a new this or that? And I said, no. I said, it's just going back, and luckily I have a foundation of work and as an artist, as a arts educator, as a community social worker, I guess, community social activist worker, I guess you would say. Uh, I like to put it as a cultural worker. Um, that that's almost become a foundation for me being able to move forward and carry that experience and take it to wherever I go. And let's see where that goes. So those motivations were very important in my process of moving over here. But also, landing over here, I've been seeing my family a lot. It's been great. Uh,
Does
but it also
California feel familiar?
it feels familiar. That was the thing, right? When people would say, "Why don't you move back here?" Why don't you come back over here? And because it always felt like that was like a just to go, like, when I graduated from from the Art Institute, people were like, "So are you coming back to California?" I'm like, "No, I think I'm okay right now. I think I'm in a place where I can grow, right?" Or when you've had like past relationships that didn't work out, and people are like, "So are you moving back now?" I'm like, "Well, that's not the reason I moved away. I moved away to grow, So if I come back, it's more on my own merits in terms as an adult, as a an individual, And so, uh, when I do move back, then it's because of because of that, independence of being yourself and bringing what you can to continue. Um,
Did the
so
current climate make it easier for you to want to move back to a familiar place? I'm from California too, and I feel like California has been calling me before all of this pandemic and revolution happened. But now I feel it more like God. Like, did I miss my call? Was that like was I supposed to be there to just chill out a little bit? Does this climate make it easier, or was that
it,
part of the decision?
uh, the climate always is easier. The thing about growing up in California was that I would see these pictures of like the East Coast or the Midwest and all these things and it was all these beautiful bright pictures, and I always thought they were all photoshopped, especially the photographs of the trees in the fall and all those things, and even in the cartoons. Remember when they would have like a haunted scenes with the ghosts,
Hmm.
and you'd hear the wind, and it would go ooh, right? Remember that? I always thought that was just cartoons, you know. When I moved to the Midwest, then I especially I wasn't used to the seasons, you know. So
They're real.
changing,
Yeah, isn't that weird?
it was true. Like the trees and the colors in the sky, they're like, wow, those really are like they're beautiful. It's like it wasn't photoshopped, you know. And being in an apartment, and the wind in Chicago, and then you hear woo, and I'm like, oh wow, that wasn't just made up for the cartoons, that kind of.
The ghosts are
Um,
real.
yeah, it's just real, right? Uh, but yeah, I mean, I it's just coming back and being where the climate is a lot sunnier. It does do a different. I think I came back with a vitamin D deficiency.
Yeah, I can hear that. I believe that. Um, as a cultural worker, I feel like right now in particular, there is a certain level of exhaustion, right? Because this conversation that we're having right now is not new. If you've been working with cultural institutions, if you're an artist of color, this is the language that you've been speaking in. This is the themes that you've been dealing with. So when it all came to boil, a lot of artists were kind of put the mic on, in front of them, like, "Hey, what are you saying? What do you think? What's your opinion?" And it's like, oh, but this is what I've been saying all along. And there's like, for me anyway, my experience has been like, whoa, like, right, what was felt is now seen. Have you? Does that resonate with you?
Yes, I mean definitely. You know, uh, growing up with all of the adults around me being immigrants and laborers, right? You see them working, and you have these conversations as to how we fit into this landscape, this American landscape, right? As an immigrant, right? And also growing up in a Black African American community, right? So there's always been these side conversations about those, right? As a kid, you would overhear these conversations from the adults, right? Because at that time, as a kid, you didn't really put in your voice as to what you felt because that wasn't allowed back then. Um, Obviously, times have changed since then. But so those conversations has always weaved itself in and out, through storytelling and through just our conversations of our experiences throughout the day, right? Whether my mother coming home early and grabbing the neighbor, telling her that immigration just went into her work. She worked at a illegal garment district factory in Los Angeles, which they're all still around. And and so those conversations, and then also talking with my Black brothers and sisters from the neighborhood, especially as with us, it was more of an open dialogue about those things, mostly sharing similarities in some of our experiences, and then within as I got older and within arts communities for over 20, 30 years ago, just these conversations are always coming up, right? Going through the LA riots, right, and how that came about through our experience, you know, growing up here in Los Angeles, right? Uh, so yeah, those conversations have always weaved themselves in and out. And then working with the communities in Chicago uh, and the neighborhoods and with different families, actually deeply focusing and using art as a tool to open up these dialogues to disenfranchisement, to uh, uh, how politics and how economic structures all segregate our very own communities, right? Or they're put together in a way that doesn't include us, right? And then dissecting the fact that those go back to hundreds and hundreds of years, right, to these old European blueprints, right, uh, of structure and dominance, right, that were created to enslave people and to insert these issues of dominance, right? So yeah, I mean, these conversations we've been having them forever. It's like
Absolutely.
it's not new at all, and so uh, it's interesting that we keep revisiting these same issues, right? But in these very neighborhoods, we've been talking it forever. It's mainstream, right? America or mainstream that I think in this country I don't, somebody said I heard someone say a long time ago that this is the United States of amnesia, right? Where something will happen, we want to put a quick fix on it, a band-aid, because and then move on, right? And we don't really address it, right? And we have this fear in this culture of addressing the ugly, right?
That sounds
And
pretty accurate.
yeah, so those conversations we try to stay away from them. So things don't eventually get resolved. We make little step-by-step progresses here and there, right? But they don't keep up with what's actually happening in the neighborhoods.
Yeah,
This systemic racism, right? And
absolutely.
so then because of that, we are not able to take bigger steps, right? And we end up being back to this, right? And it's actually, more visible, more evident, right? Uh, and uh, and I think the protests and the actions taken by neighborhoods are, I think they're on point.
Absolutely, yeah, I totally agree.
So we want to move forward. We have to face the ugly, get into this dialogue, right? Figure out how do you do restructure, uh, so that we're able to at least start making some part of progress. But it's slow. It's not going to be fast. It's not a quick fix, right? And it's up to us to hold those accountable and ourselves accountable
Absolutely.
to and all of us together.
Let me
And
ask you.
supporting Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely. Let me ask you. I'm also from California, like I said, and I also went to the East Coast. And I think my experience it was completely different had I stayed in LA. How do you feel your life would have been different if you would have stayed in California opposed to the Midwest?
It definitely would have been different. I mean, I think that my work as an artist has always been about investigating these issues, right? Uh, but it was all at that time. It was more through a conceptual artist lens, right? And uh, through the hierarchy art structure that is presented to us in art history, right? Which is white, right? All European and white, right? And so uh, I know my work would have definitely still been about these issues, right, through more conceptual lens, and trying to, I think, shape it so that it fits that, you know, uh, uh, art hierarchy, right? and and I think that I would have been successful in that way, right? But as you know, living in the LA area, and people will say, how, in LA, Los Angeles, in comparison to Chicago, what do you think? I'm like, I said, ideally, they're both basically kind of like the same. I said, except Los Angeles is like, it's like very spread out. I said, so it takes a while to get from one neighborhood to the other sometimes. I said, we see on television, right? Everything that you see, if it's not next door, right? Injustices, if it's right there, if it's not next door, or then you see it through TV, right? So there can be this disconnect to it, this personal disconnect, right? Even though, you know, my experience was as an immigrant in a black community, and I do have that experience of, having to go to the park because they were giving away the government cheese. I was, trying to go to the secondhand store and get clothes. We used to buy our clothes from a man in a yellow van. Believe it or not, we had these
Cool.
clothes, right? Yeah, we had credit with them, right? So we pick out our school clothes, our gym clothes, our everything. He'd come at once every 2 weeks and he'd collect a little bit of like almost like a layaway plan, right?
Wow.
But so I had that experience, but and that experience with with racism, I grew up with that experience. But at the same time, when you saw like protests and communities and in East Los Angeles or in South Central or in Compton or wherever, though we knew some of those people when they would come in to our side of town, and we meet up with them, but a lot of the times there was still a disconnect of sorts. Do you see what I'm saying?
No,
So
absolutely.
yeah, so I mean, and even if you were for those rights, I mean, to get involved in those, you really had to go out of your way, or there had to be a culture around you that was proactively invested in those. So what I'm saying is that, it wasn't until I moved to Chicago, where Chicago, I say like Los Angeles, is very more condensed and everyone's on top of each other. And all these social issues are right there, right next to you. I mean, the first day I landed in Chicago, I remember walking up Wabash and going up Wabash towards Wabash and Monroe, uh, State and Monroe. There was a protest on Palestinian rights, right? And I was like, wow, like it was massive. And I'm like, this is amazing, right? And then coming up directly to them on Monroe and Wabash up to meet up on State was another protest, completely different, right? On anti-abortion.
Wow.
It was pro-lifers. And to me, that just blew my mind. I'm like,
Right. Yeah.
and then so yeah, I mean, moving into when I began my work in the neighborhoods of Chicago, then that's when, I got to see a lot and experience and work with a lot of organizations that were created by the neighborhoods, right? That these community groups, right, that became their own activists, right? Whether it was for housing rights or labor rights or immigration or uh, you know, all these different different uh, advocating for all these different uh,
Causes or
prejudicial
yeah.
causes exactly, yeah. And so and what I learned, and again that was more in there you really, it's like family, right? You don't just, people will introduce you to somebody, right? And you're still kind of skeptical because you don't know them, right? And you have to kind of like earn people's trust. So it takes a while, right? And so uh, I mean, that's for me was that's how I started creating a lot of family there. All that advocacy work within the neighborhoods. One thing that I learned is like, you know, we've already seen systematically that for decades we're ignored, right? No matter how much politically, you know, we are told, vote, put yourself in the census, all these different things, right? Uh, but for the over 30 years, the very same neighborhoods still haven't gotten a dime, And so one of the things I learned from there is like, well, you know, you can have people working the political system. That's cool, and you can do what you can with voting and whatever and all that. That's great, uh, but you can't. So you can't depend on that solely, right? It is up to us to to um, to gather and organize and figure out a way to uh, keep our neighborhoods and our families surviving through these disenfranchised men, uh, you know,
That's so
assault.
right. That's so right. Can you tell me what was one of your most rewarding experiences in working with communities, working with disenfranchised populations?
Well, there's so many. I mean, when I think I started creating arts integrated curriculums all the way up to like the early 2000s, and it was social justice issues, right? And at that time, that wasn't really introduced. It wasn't in schools, right? I think only barely like in the past 4 or 5 years, yeah, in Chicago public schools, they started saying, "Oh, let's create a civic, social, curriculum," right? Um, but I want to say there's been so many. I think one of the first ones, right, was when I was in. It was my last year of going to the Art Institute, right, and I was part of a group. It was called, I believe it was LASA, right, Latin American Students Organization, right. It was put together by, I mean, it was the Art Institute. So there was only like maybe like five Mexicans or five Latinos that go in there, right? Our faces weren't that visible there. So I remember that meeting a community member in Pilsen, right? And her name was Neri, and Neri was a Salvadorian refugee, right? And she got asylum through she was a victim of torture, you know, by the Salvadorian government regime in the 80s, right? She was she was an ecologist, right? And she taught ecology, I believe, at a university in El Salvador or something, in some type of educational system. But you got to remember at that time, so they were very proactive in the communities, and so along with the other people that were perhaps in the news, like that were journalists or were artists, and they began to be hunted down, right? And so she was captured, and then she was tortured while she was pregnant. She lost her pregnancy during that, and with her husband in front, and so eventually through she was able to seek asylum in the U.S. and come on over here, and she was getting treatment over here as well. So she was living in Pilsen, and she started seeing at that time that there wasn't that much. It's all buildings, right? There's not parks. There weren't that many. There weren't any parks. There's one, but there was not. So she ended up getting kids after school, in a group of 3 or 4 or 5, and she started having like ecology classes, right? They started growing their own chiles, right? And then they started selling them, in the community, and that would help you to create more workshops, right? And then eventually she taught them how to raise tilapia, and how to create using recyclable material systems to be able to raise fish. Pretty interesting, right, to feed the community. So she started doing all these interesting programs, and so that was the first time that we wanted to do something with her in the sense of doing art lessons for those kids. And she said, she goes, well, why don't you? She goes, that's fantastic, But may I say, can you at least integrate it into these ecological system, right? Educational. And so that was one of the first times that we used linoleum prints, to talk about these issues of environment, ecology, all those different things, right? That was one of them, you know. Since then, I worked with the Japanese American community there. Uh, we It was an 8 month project. It was supposed to be 4 months, and then it went into 8 months because of the dialogue. But we worked with the community because they wanted to create. It was commemorating their 60th anniversary, right? And so they wanted to create a mural that depicted Japanese lifestyle, American Japanese lifestyle here in the United States, right? But also before, during, and after the war, right? But definitely talking about Japanese life, and then also with a big focus on Japanese in the internment / concentration camps during the war,
Right.
right? So that was another one that was really
That's
good.
great. I mean, going back to the ecology, I think it's really important. And what a powerhouse to be able to activate art, right? Because when a lot of times educational institutions think about art, they think, oh, right, they're going to just give them crayons, white piece of paper, let them draw for an hour. When
Mm-hmm.
in fact, it's such a powerful tool to teach anybody, not only kids, how to see, how to inquiry, how to pose questions. And that sounds like that's what you were doing, and that's fantastic. I think there needs to be more of that, especially right now in this moment of, revolution. I keep saying, because this is how this is a way of posing questions, a way of seeing things, the art lens. Now, talk to me a little bit about your art. It's so funny. There's so much going on in the world that I hardly ever get to talk about the artist's work because we're talking about how you use your work to, mobilize change. So tell me a little bit about your work. How did you stumble in your medium?
Well, I mean, so obviously, I stumbled. My medium is I'm a multidisciplinary artist, right? So I work with all different types of materials. Let me, if you don't mind, let me read a little bit of my statement because every time I talk about this, I always leave all kinds of things out.
Go for it.
And so let me just, that'll help me a bit. Um, so let me see here. So as a multidisciplinary artist, here we go. I investigate and challenge how perspectives today continue to be shaped by an old past colonial rule, a European blueprint of laws that have created and normalized an American culture or narrative built to dominate or create systems of power that have led to today's social and class divides on issues of immigration, racism, violence, religion, etc. And that has historically disenfranchised communities of color. In my art practice, I confront these barriers or perspectives determined to own through aggression or dominance the same social racial issues that incoming immigrants and new generations of Mexicanos and Latinx people still face today. So that's
God, so relevant with with everything that's happening right now, right?
yes. So yeah. So I mean, and one of the things with my artwork as an artist, again, these issues have always been at the forefront based on my experience, right? Growing up and what I've seen, and how I myself or my family or my community has interacted with the rest of the neighborhoods and communities, or how we were treated, right? Um, and so one of the first experiences I remember when I was a kid, we moved into Pasadena, and we were. It was how would you say? There, it was more on the lower scale, right? And we rented a room. We rented a room from a family, and and the projects were just right there, just right up the street, right? And it was a Black African American neighborhood, right? So I remember at that time going up Hammond Street, going up to the Boys Market, and we're walking, and I remember I would hear little things, like hitting the wall, and then we realized that people were throwing rocks at us, right? And we get to the store, and I remember walking back, and I remember that there was a little girl, and she was like, saw my mom, and I think, she was talking to us, but she was yelling obscenities. And at that time, I don't remember exactly because I remember that I was still learning English, right? And but I remember my mother was pregnant at the time, and she was like, "Well, I'll kill your baby," and stuff like that, right? And there was another little girl my age, right? So, and when we got back to the house, my mom was telling our neighbor, and my neighbor was like, she's like, she was, uh, my mother was pulled out of school when she was like about 11 or 12 in Mexico. From then on, you had to pay for your education, and they couldn't afford it. My mother and her brothers and sisters lost their parents before they were even 10 years old. They lost both of them. So they were dispersed throughout the family. Sorry, I'm giving you a little back content here. So after the fifth or sixth grade, because she was a girl, she was pulled out, and because they were also not the immediate children of her uncles and aunts, right? They weren't going to pay money to send them to school. That makes sense? Um, and, um, and so her education on history was very limited. So fast forward to this incident when, she's telling my neighbor what happened. My neighbor's like, "Oh, let me tell you a little bit about." She explained to her a little bit about American Black history, right, and the Civil Rights Movement. And this was like mid '70s, and so it was pretty raw. Students read it. It's it had been not even 10, 15 years that MLK had been taken. Malcolm X and all, and Kennedy, all these people. So it was pretty raw. So because we were light-skinned Mexicans, right, and we're white, right? So they were in that neighborhood. I think we were like one of two families that lived in that neighborhood that was Black African American neighborhood, right? And so if you ever saw anybody that was white in the neighborhood, it's because they were lost, but they're looking for drugs, you know. So that's when we began to learn a little more as to why, that was happening to us, because we didn't understand, and we were like, but we're not white, and we're not this, but that's when you start thinking about like, oh, this thing's a little more. There's more to look into this, right? There's a lot of gray areas into this, right? Later on, though, you know, eventually, I think they were like, oh, the, they're Mexican, and
What a harsh
yeah,
thing to
we're
learn as
all in
a
this.
child, right?
Yeah, and eventually they're like, we're all in this. We're all here because we're all poor. So we all grew up together, and talking about these issues, So it was something that through time, we learned more about each other, and then we were accepted in the community. Did
How
that make
did
sense?
yeah? How did that process? How did you process that as a child? Did that make you more interested in history, or did it make you kind of want to avoid it, or how was that? How did that work in your
You
child's
know,
mind?
you know. I think that at that time, I was just mostly experiencing and trying to put it into some form of context. Because at that time, I'm a kid. I was like 4 or 5 years old, and as I'm growing up, um, I'm also by the time I was a teenager, I was able to put it a little more together, right? Again, because a lot of my friends were were um, were Mexicanos, immigrants, or Salvadorians, or South American, and African American or Black. We grew up together, so we always grew up talking about these. We started because we would talk about it. We realized there are similarities in our experience growing up, here. Um, but I think for me, it's like mostly always every time there was experiences, I was trying to put it into context, right? Trying to figure out like, well, but why am I, like, but and thinking in that way, right? And then trying to investigate it. When I was 12, 11, maybe between 10 or 12, at our school, which was a predominantly Black school and Mexicanos, our principal, she was pretty amazing. Uh, she would, before school started, she would have us all gather in the playground, and she would reiterate and really emphasize to us and had us repeat why we were valuable, why we're beautiful,
Wow.
and why we were number one, right? And then I remember sometime those years when we were doing, uh, which is pretty amazing because I think uh, if I would have been in a white school at that time, it would have been a completely different experience, right? But she when it came to when we got into the issues of in American history of slavery, it was pretty in depth, actually. And that's what I mean. I wouldn't have got that same history somewhere else, right? And I remember them showing us a movie on 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 Harriet Tubman, right? And and it was pretty raw. Like, I mean, it was uncensored, right? And and I remember watching it, and we were reading about it, so we can put it a little bit into context. And and you seeing black folks being hung, and you seeing all these things happening on there, and we're like somewhere between the ages of 10 and 12, so we're kind of just looking at it. And then next to me, my friend Annika was next to me, and we're all good friends, right? And I was always that little Mexican kid that was always with the black crowd when we were breakdancing outside, right?
Mhm.
So I remember that Annika turned over to me, and she was dogging me. She was giving me this look, right? She was just like, and I'm like, what? And she's like, just nodded her head, like, you know what? And I'm like, and I got it. I'm like, but but I'm Mexican. And she said, it don't matter. She goes, you're colored. And I'm like, and so, but that was a, a quick reaction also. And this is based on her experience. Her family's had to live through this, right? They've had to talk about this. And so having to look at it in school, it's like, then you're carrying it with you all day, right? And but I understood it. I understood where that come from, and I also understood that there was, obviously, because of that there was it was very layered, these issues of race, right, and these issues of class divides, right, because I also grew up in that neighborhood. I mean, after that, I mean, maybe like 40 minutes later or something, like, we're all hanging out still, but it
Yeah,
was,
that's
you know,
interesting. Because I feel like that story almost feels like it's very LA in the sense that because in LA things are so spread out and there's a wider gap in segregation. Here in New York or in Chicago,
hmm
like you said, you're all mixed, and there's never that like otherness for the most part because we're so we've always been exposed to each other's presence, which is something that was new to me because like I said, I'm from LA and I didn't realize I was Mexican until I came here because everybody around me was Mexican. I thought if you're Latino, you're obviously Mexican, which was like,
uh-huh.
what? So to come here, you're like, wow. And I mean, that was such an eye opener. But I also felt that my Latino, well, right. I went from being Mexican to being Latino. Right now, I'm like this part of this broader
Uh-huh.
pan
Uh,
experience. But my dialogue changed because there's no way I could have the same dialogue about being Mexican in LA as being Mexican or Latino in New York because all of a sudden it just goes poof, right. Do you
yeah.
feel now that you're back in California that your dialogue, in what way do you think the context will change your dialogue or the conversation that you need to have with the people around you?
I mean, I think as I got older, I realized that my experience growing up through all this is like my story is valuable, right? And a lot of our stories haven't been written about, right? And when it has, it's been narrated through an other lens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, then there's been biases that have been written about us, or lack of, I guess you'd say, historical content, right? And then also just something is missing in that overall uh, narrative, right? And so yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, like, again, all those, as I got older, I've been able to obviously look at that, read a lot, um, but also just engage more in community, right? Engage more in 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 being part of that dialogue, right? As to how these structures affect our communities and how they have been through for hundreds of years, right? Um, and they and they definitely, I mean, you know, it's changed the landscape, right? Because that experience that I just told you when I was when between the ages of 10 and 12, when I started teaching in the neighborhoods in Chicago, when I actually started setting foot into a classroom, um, walking in there and I see all these Mexican kids, right, that look like me, or all these Latino kids that look like me, right? And I realized for them, they hadn't seen someone like me in their classroom, right? Like, you're an artist, and so those experiences taught me that I can't just get the that lesson that someone else already wrote on how to address racism, right?
Right. Right.
Because our people didn't write it, right? Uh, it was probably it was an education that was put together 50 years ago that's still being implemented today, right? So I knew that when approaching these issues and working with these students and just figuring out how to create an honest dialogue that could help us go into it and an unbiased to and create a safe space, right? An unbiased space where all different points of views can be accepted, right? At least accept it, trust one another with that, so that we're able to at least reach an honest dialogue with its accuracies and inaccuracies based on our experiences, right? So I knew right away when I started doing that I had to um, I had to that was very layered, right? And I don't know what all those layers are. I know some of those based on my experiences and my conversations with the community members uh, and and historians, from our neighborhoods and from our people. But I knew that everyone's story is different. And one of the first things I would say when I come into the classroom was like, listen, um, I grew up in a low income neighborhood and as an immigrant in a black community and this and that. I said, but I'm in Chicago. I said, I know I'm an outsider no matter what. I said, because I cannot come in here and and tell you that you need to listen to me as to how I cannot tell you what your story is, and I cannot tell you how you're going to write your story. I said because it's different. I said this Mexican immigrant kid from Los Angeles area, my experience is different than a Mexican kid that grew up in Chicago. I said the last thing I'm going to do is appropriate my experience onto you and use it to tell you how to tell your story. I can't do that. So that's one of the first things. That's the first thing I would always say coming in, right?
That's great. Yeah, that's a good context.
So I mean, um, and so Chicago is, like I said, it's very much like California, and very progressive, ideally, but at the same time, because of all the corruption that happens over there politically, that's ingrained corruption, right, and racism, it's still also very 10 years behind,
Mm.
right? But and so the laborer gets screwed left and right, right? The person of color gets screwed left and right over there, and so, but the beautiful thing about it is, again, like I said, um, the neighborhoods and the community members coming together, right? Because I wasn't the first one to go in there and say, "Hey, this is how I teach and this is how I approach this." I mean, there was already a long line of artist activism going on there. A lot of arts educators that have been working throughout the community for many years before then, that I had the privilege of knowing and learning from as well, who taught me how to look into my own personal voice and use that as an experience. And because of that, there's a very, very strong presence of the work that we've all done now, where you're seeing a lot of arts integrated activism work, right? Mm, one of the I'm part of a collective called the Chicago Act Collective, right? which is it's a group of members, artists, teachers, educators, philosophers, all those things. We came together in 2015 to create artwork in response to social issues, but respond them from the very people it's impacted,
That's
and
great.
continue to do a lot of amazing work. I think it's part of that work that has fed into seeing a lot of art being visible today as part of that platform of activism, which I think is pretty amazing,
Absolutely.
And I'm only a little hair from a long line of amazing artists that are in there 100%.
That's amazing. Now, to close, I want to ask you, you've kind of like have this homecoming, right?
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to your younger self when you were about to go to the Art Institute of Chicago? This is the legacy. This is the lesson that you're going to learn. What would that be? What's one of the biggest things that you learned from being away?
Really, Luis? Really? Like, hey, what would you tell your younger self? Really?
You didn't have to go anywhere. That's what I would have. That's what I would tell myself.
No, I mean, the only thing I can say is again, because I just landed here, so I'm going to continue to grow with what I've learned from growing up here and with what I guess you would say Chicago made me, right? And so what I would say mostly is like what I learned up to this point, because it hasn't been easy, just like it hasn't been for any of us, right? There's a lot of struggle in there. As I would say to myself back then, I guess I would say, listen, don't depend on others, right? To tell you how valuable you are.
Hmm.
I would say you are valuable. You're a valuable Mexican. You're a valuable American. You're a valuable immigrant. You are. There's value in your poverty. There's value in your struggle. There's value in your redemption. There's value in your honesty. There's value in your faults. There's value in your queerness. And there's power in yourself. And with that, move forward and take it on that, you know what, fuck them all. You're powerful and you're beautiful. And as people of color, we got this. We're going to move forward. We've survived through it as a 48-year-old Mexican man. I'm like, knock on wood, I haven't been to jail. I
All
did.
right.
Not a drug addict. I'm not all those things that society has told me was going to be my fate. I made it this far. I'm taking all that with me, and I'll move forward with that. And let's see where it takes me.
I love that. Juan Carlos, thank you so much for sitting with me and sharing this. And that's exactly what I was looking for. And I'm a better person for having heard it. I really am. So I appreciate you, and we'll continue our conversation at some point.
Luis, thank you for having me on here, and I really appreciate the work that you do to contribute to our community. Gracias, man.
Thank you. De nada.
Órale.